Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Bantam to Behemoth by the band Birds and Buildings.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
There's so many B's, like everything starts off with a B. It's Bantam to Behemoth by Birds and Buildings, and yeah, it's pretty funny, and it's probably done so intentionally. And on another note, this is probably the longest script I've ever written for a video, so I wouldn't be surprised if this one actually marked at like 20 minutes of runtime, because honestly there's so much to say about this album, so I won't be taking any more time. Here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So the year 2008 is an interesting year for progressive rock music, in which we've seen some really interesting releases like Moon Safari's Bloomjud, which is rated as that year's number 5 spot over on the Prog Archives. We also have Sleeping in Traffic Park 2 by Beardfish, which is at number 3, and we have number 1 of that year, an album made by a then unknown band that came out of nowhere called Birds and Buildings, and their debut album is the album we're reviewing today, called Bantam to Behemoth. Now technically it's incorrect to say that Birds and Buildings came out of nowhere, because this band was just one of the projects that was associated with Dan Britton. While still being a part of 2 other bands, Dan Britton actually formed this band with his past member from Deluge Grandeur called Brett de Anon, and together they formed this eclectic prog group called Birds and Buildings. Now from what I've gathered, and I can't really say this for 100% certainty, I think that the reason that Dan Britton was a part of so many different bands at the time, at least, was because each of them had their own mission goal of actually creating a different type of progressive subgenre. So I believe he was a part of a jazz fusion group as well as a symphonic prog group, but Birds and Buildings was made in the premise of creating eclectic prog, and this is the reason probably why they had to make a whole new band for that reason. Now Birds and Buildings have set out to try and somehow stand up to the standards of the very overwhelming genre of eclectic prog. Now I believe that out of all the progressive subgenres, eclectic prog is the one that is most hardly to achieve, with it being very hard to actually be called eclectic all the way through, but when it is done right, it's really hard for it to sound good. And I must mention that this album today has to be one of, if not the best interpretation of this specific subgenre. That being said, I would have given this title to an album like Matkamiel and Yeremin by Saima that we reviewed a few days ago, but I don't think it really fits because that group didn't really quite incorporate the progressive rock aspect into the things. But the thing about this album is it feels very eclectic, taking a lot of inspirations from a whole lot of other different genres in music, but as well always sounding progressive in its nature. Now, the funny thing about this album in particular is that besides being an eclectic prog album, you could actually argue and make the case that this album would fit quite perfectly into the realm of Zool. But this classification wouldn't really work on all the tracks found on this album and mainly is relevant for the longer ones. And the type of Zool that this album could be associated with isn't your typical magma Zool that's very high pitched and very all over the place and very energetic, but more like an eschaton for Vision type of Zool, which is calmer, more symphonic, more melodical, and personally a Zool type that I much prefer. Now, I'm really sorry to have bored you all with this long prologue, but I think it's really important for us to actually be able to understand this album just a bit better. But now that we're over that, we can get into the amazingness that is Bantam to Behemoth, and when I say amazingness, I do mean every syllable of it. This album is #1 and for a good reason. Now, this album opens up with the first track called Birds Flying into Buildings, which is a pretty obscure name, and it also of course has something to do with the name of the band itself, and it actually also has something to do with the cover of this album, but we'll get to that later. And this first track is a perfect opener for this album, immediately going on a 100% throttle, throwing you into the music without really getting you ready for it. And the lovely thing that I like about this one is that it basically tells the listener, if you like what you hear, stay, and if you don't, leave now and never come back, because this is what this album is going to be. Now, the reason I believe this is a great opener, besides the fact that it somehow incorporates Zool with something that sounds more like King Crimson together, is because this one is a lovely symphonic epic that is also an instrumental. Now, you might ask yourself, why is it crucial it being an instrumental? And my reason for it is that the band were able to show most of their contentness with this song before actually incorporating vocals into it, thus making anyone that comes across this album pretty sure of what this band is capable of, and if they like what they hear, they should actually stay for the entire duration of this album. And then we move on to the next track called Terra Fire. Now, Terra Fire is the different type of songs found on this album. So of course you have the longer, the epic ones, the giant ones, the Zool influenced ones, but you also have the simpler, the shorter tracks on here. And I'm not saying contemporary because they're not contemporary like at all, but they're definitely the lower points on this album. But I will say this, the fact that they're shorter makes them actually quite bearable and even quite fun to listen to without actually ever getting this interesting, which is something that I really appreciate about how they're made. And I often just prefer to look at these songs as some sort of flourishes to the entirety of this album, because it does actually add a lot when it comes in small doses. Now, personally, I believe that this album reaches its peak with the fourth track called Caution Congregates and Forms a Storm. This one is an absolute masterpiece of modern symphonic prog. Yes, I know this is eclectic prog, but I would call this one more like a symphonic prog one, because it starts off with a combination of a guitar and a flute which gradually have more and more layers built upon them, and then it changes things up, and this song just kind of opens up, it kind of blooms, and then it reveals something that's just bigger than life, in all honesty, and I love it to bits. I listen to each and every second of it with absolute awe, and I love this one so much. I can't put an emphasis on it. And the funny thing is, there's actually another song on here which would be my favorite, but I'm not gonna point it out quite yet because we'll get to it in a few minutes. And this song in particular really caught me by surprise when I was writing the review for this album, because the thing about this one and most of the reviews that I do is usually when we deal with eclectic prog, I try and note down to myself what types of influences do I hear in the music, and whenever I tried writing something down, the music ever so slightly changed to something else that sounded like it was influenced by something else, and thus really created this entire experience when nothing was quite certain but everything just worked. And in the same breath, I would like to point out what is probably the biggest upside that there is on this album, and specifically with this band in particular. Birds and Buildings have mastered the method of transitions, and I don't mean transition from one song to the next one, I mean transitions within one given song. Basically, from the dawn of progressive rock, all eclectic, symphonic, folk, psych, space, and whatnot prog were reliant on one thing in particular, and that's being able to seamlessly move from one musical idea to the next musical idea all within one composition and do so seamlessly. And this method of transitioning could only be described as being a form of art, when you have two ideas which might not be even slightly connected to one another, but at the same time you're able to seamlessly and very organically move through each and every one of them. I think the best pieces that feature that are pieces like Close to the Edge, and maybe most prominently actually As Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull, which features so many different musical ideas within it, yet at the same time it somehow manages to stay and sound like one long 40-minute song. And I wholeheartedly believe that Birds and Buildings were able to capture that and actually use it for themselves, and do so quite masterfully, because at no point in this entire album do I feel like any transition was too abrupt, too unexpected, too unrelated. Everything feels like it flows correctly as it should, despite many transitions occurring from very different musical ideas to others. I would like to mention the next track, called Chronicle of the Invisible River of Stone, mostly because it's a nice long track, but also because it has the lovely vocals by guest musician Megan Wheatley. So yeah, just throwing that out there. And the next song on here is called Yucatan 65, the Agitation of the Mass. And this one is when it dawned on me how grand of a sound this album manages to accomplish with actually having a pretty limited amount of instruments being used. This album, at least when credits are concerned, only features your basic lineup of a bass, the drum kit, a guitar and some keyboards, and also the added benefit by Brian Folkowski, which oftentimes plays the clarinet, saxophone or flute. And despite not having a wide range ensemble like a band like Magma, they somehow manage to capture the same greatness that that band does, if not even outdoing it at times. Now then we move on to another track called Chakra Khan, which I would love to talk about, but this is getting very long and I have so much to say, so just go ahead and listen to that song. It's an amazing song. But then the next song is my second favorite from this album, called Battalion. And when I say second favorite, I don't mean that it's like my second rated favorite. No, I believe this one and my first favorite from this album, which has a name which I've already managed to forget, but it's actually called Caution Congregates and Forms a Storm. Yeah, I'm forgetting the names of songs from this album because they're quite tricky. Anyway, Battalion is an amazing track which for some unknown reason has made me quite emotional when listening to it and when re-listening to it since then. I don't know what it is about it, but something about it just plucks my heartstrings. I really like that, and that's probably the reason why I also believe this one to be a perfect track. And this track I believe also taught me one very important thing about this band, and that's their way of utilizing every single way of actually creating great music. And I'm not only meaning the instrumentation and the way that they play them, but stuff more basic like time signatures or stereo mixing or using synthesized sounds and many more ideas that are oftentimes just overlooked when it comes to music production. And then this album closes off with what is the shortest track on this entire album, called Sunken City Sunny Day, which is a title taken right off of a Between the Buried and Me album. And this one surprisingly sounds a lot like something you'd find from Pink Floyd's The Endless River, which if you've listened to this entire album up until this point, you wouldn't really be expecting anything like Pink Floyd. You'd be expecting something that sounds more like Yes or Genesis or Gentle Giant or even Jethro Tull or King Crimson, but nothing like the spaciness of Pink Floyd. But this last track is easily one that could have been taken straight away from an album like The Division Bell or The Endless River, and I wouldn't even bat an eye. So all in all, I would have to say that this album is definitely a magnum opus of the modern era when it comes to eclectic prog and overall even symphonic prog. I really enjoyed this one. Is it better than Beard Fist Sleeping in Traffic Part 2? I don't know, but at the same time when I reviewed that album I wanted to give it a 9 and now it's like an 11 or 12, so I really don't know. I guess time will tell. The one thing I will point out about this album, which isn't really a downside but it's just something that exists on it, is the fact that it can be quite overwhelming, especially for someone who listens to it the first time all the way through. I considered taking a break in the middle of this album to, you know, digest what I've just listened to. I decided not to do so because I really enjoyed the experience overall, but I do find that the feelings that you get from this album, and you know, your mind is racing from the music, and it can get indeed somewhat overwhelming. But I'm really happy to see that the members of the Prog Archives have voted this one to be the top album of 2008, basically going to prove that 70s prog inspired music can still and will still prevail in the wide array of prog nowadays. Fuck me, this is one of the longest scripts I've ever written. Like, this was 5 pages of script. Like, it's too much. I have some scripts which don't even go over the 2-page threshold, so you know what that means. We have to move on to talk about the cover. So, if I wish to have summarized this cover in one sentence, I think that I'm out of luck. So, I remember when I made the intro for this series and I looked at the covers and I chose this one to be featured on the intro, and I remember looking it up on Google and looking for a high resolution picture of this cover, only to always find very pixelated images of it. Now, the funny thing was, the image in the background was pixelated, but the text was usually perfectly sharp. And you know what, back at the time I really didn't think a lot about it, and I was just like, okay, yeah, so it's pixelated and who cares, and I just kind of took it and went on with it. But now that I made the research, I finally understood why that is. You see, when an image is pixelated, it usually means one of two things. The one is that the original image was taken in a very low quality, or the other is that the image is just part of a much bigger picture. And this is exactly the case that we have here. This cover is actually a small, minute, tiny fraction of a bigger picture, and this is of course taken from Hieronymus Bosch's painting The Garden of Earthly Delights. So as you can see, this cover was taken from this image. Oh, you can't see it? Well, okay, it's fine. Look in the left panel, it's over there. Oh, you still can't see it. Okay, let me enhance. Yeah, okay, I think you can see it now. And from this tiny piece of one of the greatest triptychs ever made, we get a small fraction that makes the album cover for this one, and also the name for the band itself, which is of course Birds in Buildings. As you can see, there are birds going through this building. And might this image have a bigger than life meaning that I just don't know of? Well, probably it does, but I'm really not getting into that right now. So this album is amazing, but if I have to be honest, I am not really looking to re-listen to it like a whole lot of times right now. I've listened to it again, but in all honesty, it's not one that I long to come back to too enthusiastically. So despite it being amazing and very much perfect in many senses, I think that it will for now get a rating of 9 out of 10, but maybe in the future this will be a 10 out of 10 album. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because tomorrow's episode marks a very important landmark in the series so far. It will be, of course, the halfway point of the series. It will be the episode in the middle that have marked half of the series behind us and half of it still remaining in front of us. And for this occasion, I have gotten for us all a very special album by a very special band called Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and of course we're going to be reviewing the album known as Love Beach. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallum, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.